Sometimes the most extraordinary people walk among us in the most ordinary disguises. They sit on park benches with worn clothes and weathered hands, invisible to a world that judges worth by appearance. But what happens when a single moment of recognition shatters everything you thought you knew about honor, sacrifice, and the true meaning of heroism? This is the story of a man whose greatest victory came not in uniform but in rags.
A tale that will make you question every assumption you've ever made about the homeless figure on the corner, and remind you that some of history's greatest warriors choose their battles not on foreign soil, but on the very streets where they once returned as forgotten heroes. What you're about to discover will change how you see every person society has taught you to overlook.
The morning sun cast long shadows across downtown Chicago as Thomas Miller shuffled along Michigan Avenue, his worn boots scraping against the concrete. His beard, now streaked with gray, hung unkempt against his chest, and his clothes carried the musty smell of too many nights spent in doorways and under bridges.
To the thousands of commuters rushing past him, he was nothing more than another piece of urban decay, a problem to be stepped around rather than a person to be acknowledged. Thomas had grown accustomed to the invisible barrier that seemed to surround him wherever he went.
People's eyes would slide past him as if he were part of the architecture, their conversations never pausing even when he was standing right beside them. He had become a ghost in plain sight, haunting the streets of a city that had once welcomed him home as a hero.
The irony wasn't lost on him. 15 years ago he had walked these same streets in dress blues, chest adorned with ribbons and medals that told stories of courage under fire. Children had pointed at him with admiration. Women had smiled. And men had nodded with respect. Now those same streets treated him like a disease to be avoided. His stomach growled as he approached the coffee shop on the corner of State Street.
Through the large windows he could see the morning rush in full swing, business people in tailored suits clutching their phones and expensive coffee cups, their faces tight with the stress of deadlines and meetings. Thomas knew better than to go inside. The last time he had tried, the barista had taken one look at him and called security before he could even speak. Instead, he positioned himself near the entrance, far enough away to avoid being accused of blocking the door, but close enough that someone might notice him. He pulled out a small cardboard sign from his backpack, the edges soft from handling. In careful block letters he had written, "Homeless veteran. Anything helps." The sign told his story in 4 simple words, though he knew most people wouldn't bother to read even that much.
The first hour brought nothing but averted gazes and wide berths. A mother pulled her young son closer as they passed, whispering something about not staring.
A businessman in an expensive overcoat actually stepped into the street, rather than walk past Thomas on the sidewalk. Each interaction, or lack thereof, was a small cut that had long since stopped bleeding but never stopped hurting. Around 9:30, a young woman in scrubs approached the coffee shop. Thomas recognized her as one of the nurses from the hospital down the street. She had kind eyes, the sort that seemed to actually see people rather than just looking through them. As she walked past, she slowed down and reached into her purse. "Here," she said softly, placing a $5 bill in the coffee cup Thomas used for donations. "Get yourself something warm." "Thank you, ma'am," Thomas replied, his voice rough from disuse. "God bless." She smiled and continued into the coffee shop. It was a small moment of humanity in what had become an increasingly dehumanized existence, and Thomas felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. The kindness gave him hope for the rest of the day, but as the lunch hour approached, his optimism began to fade. The sidewalk traffic increased, but so did the hostile stares. A security guard from the building across the street had been watching him for the past hour, and Thomas knew it was only a matter of time before he was asked to move along. It was then that he noticed the group of teenagers approaching. They wore the uniform of privilege, expensive sneakers, designer clothes, and the casual arrogance that came with never having to worry about where their next meal would come from. Thomas had seen their type before, and he instinctively tensed as they drew closer. "Look at this loser," one of them said loudly, making sure his voice carried to the other pedestrians. "Probably spent all his money on drugs." "Yeah, get a job, man," another chimed in. "Stop being a burden on society." The third teenager, apparently feeling left out of the harassment, decided to escalate things. He pulled out his phone and started recording. "Hey everybody, look at this pathetic excuse for a human being. This is what failure looks like." Thomas kept his eyes down, hoping they would get bored and move on. He had learned long ago that engaging with people like this only made things worse. But the teenagers seemed determined to make him the entertainment for their social media followers. "What's wrong? Can't even look at us." The first one taunted. "Too ashamed of what you've become? The one with the phone stepped closer, aiming the camera directly at Thomas's face. "Come on, say something for my followers.
Tell them how you ended up living like an animal." "Maybe we should call the cops," the third teenager suggested with mock concern.
I mean, he's probably dangerous. Who knows what someone like that might do?" The small crowd that had gathered was mostly silent, but Thomas could feel their judgment like a physical weight. Some looked uncomfortable with the teenager's behavior, but no one intervened. In their eyes, he saw a mixture of pity, disgust, and fear. To them, he had ceased to be human. Somewhere along the way. He had become a cautionary tale, a worst-case scenario that they used to feel better about their own lives. "Please," Thomas said quietly, still not looking up. "Just leave me alone." "Oh, he speaks!" the teenager with the phone exclaimed.
"Did you guys hear that? The homeless guy actually knows words." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, cutting through the ambient noise of the city street. Thomas felt something inside him break, not for the first time but perhaps more completely than ever before. These kids, who couldn't be more than 17 or 18, were treating him like he was less than human.
They were broadcasting his humiliation to their friends, turning his pain into entertainment. In that moment, Thomas thought about the men he had served with overseas. He thought about Marcus, who had taken shrapnel in his back to protect a convoy of civilians. He thought about Rodriguez, who had died trying to defuse an improvised explosive device that would have killed dozens of innocent people. He thought about all the good men and women who had given everything in service to their country, and he wondered what they would think of how that country was treating one of their own now. The teenagers were still talking, still filming, still treating him like a piece of street theater for their amusement. The crowd around them had grown larger, drawn by the spectacle like rubberneckers at a car accident. Thomas could hear fragments of conversation, people speculating about how someone ends up homeless, others making assumptions about drug use and mental illness. None of them considered that the man they were watching might have once stood between them and harm's way. As the harassment continued, Thomas closed his eyes and tried to transport himself somewhere else. He thought about the mountains of Afghanistan, where the air was thin and clean, and the stars at night were so bright they seemed close enough to touch. He thought about the camaraderie of his unit, the way they had looked out for each other when the world seemed determined to tear them apart. He thought about the letters from home, the care packages, the yellow ribbons that had adorned every other car in America during the height of the war. Where were those ribbons now? Where was that support when the cameras stopped rolling and the parades ended? Thomas had come home to a country that thanked him for his service with one breath and ignored his suffering with the next. The transition from soldier to civilian had been harder than any battle he had fought overseas, and the war that raged in his mind was one for which there seemed to be no victory condition. The teenagers finally grew bored with their sport and moved on, but not before the one with the phone made a final comment about calling social services to clean up the trash. Their laughter echoed off the buildings as they disappeared into the crowd, leaving Thomas alone with his shame and the curious stares of the remaining onlookers. As the crowd dispersed, Thomas caught sight of his reflection in the coffee shop window. The man staring back at him was almost unrecognizable from the soldier who had once stood at attention during military ceremonies. His eyes, once sharp and alert, now seemed hollow and defeated. His posture, once proud and straight, had curved inward as if trying to make himself smaller and less noticeable. But somewhere deep inside, buried under layers of disappointment and despair, a part of him still remembered what it felt like to be treated with respect. A part of him still carried the discipline and honor that had been forged in the crucible of military service. That part of him, no matter how dormant, refused to be completely extinguished by the cruelty of strangers and the indifference of society. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas continued his quiet vigil outside the coffee shop. The $5 from the nurse would be enough for a small meal, maybe enough to get him through another day. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges, the same struggles, the same invisibility that had become his unwanted superpower. He didn't know that in less than 24 hours, that invisibility would be shattered in a way that would change not only his life, but the lives of everyone who witnessed what was about to unfold.
He didn't know that a single moment of recognition would remind an entire city that heroes don't always wear capes, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with the simple act of remembering someone's humanity. For now, Thomas Miller remained what he had been for too many years, a ghost haunting the margins of a society that had forgotten how to see its own heroes.
But ghosts, as any storyteller knows, have a way of making themselves known when the time is right. And Thomas's time was coming, whether he knew it or not. The next morning arrived gray and cold, with the kind of Chicago wind that seemed to cut through even the thickest layers of clothing. Thomas had spent the night in a doorway 3 blocks from his usual spot, huddled against his worn sleeping bag and listening to the sounds of a city that never truly slept. His joints ached from the hard concrete, and his stomach reminded him that the small sandwich he had managed to buy yesterday was now just a memory. By 8 o'clock, he was back on his corner, settling into the routine that had become his life. The morning commuters flowed past him in predictable waves, each person locked in their own world of deadlines and responsibilities. Thomas had learned to read the patterns of the street the way he had once read the terrain in hostile territory. He knew which people were most likely to help and which ones would go out of their way to avoid him. The coffee shop was busier than usual, with a line extending out the door. Through the windows, Thomas could see harried baristas working frantically to keep up with the morning rush. The smell of fresh coffee and pastries drifted through the air, making his empty stomach clench with longing. He pressed his back against the cold brick wall and tried to make himself as small as possible. Around 9:15, Thomas noticed a commotion down the street. A small crowd had gathered near the intersection, and he could hear the distant sound of shouting and car horns. His military training kicked in automatically, his senses sharpening as he tried to assess what was happening. Years of living on the streets had taught him to be wary of any disturbance that might affect his safety. As he watched, the crowd began to move in his direction. At the center of the group, Thomas could make out several people in military dress uniforms. His heart rate increased slightly, old instincts awakening despite his efforts to remain invisible. Military personnel in downtown Chicago usually meant some kind of ceremony or official event, and those events typically brought increased police presence and pressure to clean up the area. The group drew closer, and Thomas could see more details. There were perhaps a dozen soldiers in total, their uniforms crisp and decorated with the ribbons and insignia of various ranks and units. Leading them was a man who appeared to be in his 50s, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command.
The stars on his shoulder indicated he was a general, though Thomas couldn't make out which branch or how many stars from his position. The soldiers were clearly looking for something or someone, their heads turning as they scanned the street.
Thomas felt a familiar knot of anxiety form in his stomach. Military police had rousted him before, usually at the request of local business owners who complained about homeless veterans hurting the image of their establishments.
The irony of veterans being harassed by other service members was not lost on him, but it happened more often than the public realized. Thomas began gathering his few possessions, preparing to move to another location before the soldiers reached his corner.
But as he stood up, something stopped him. The general at the head of the group had frozen in place, his eyes locked directly on Thomas's face. The man's expression shifted from casual attention to intense focus, as if he were trying to solve a complex puzzle. The general raised his hand and the entire group of soldiers came to a halt. The morning pedestrians continued to flow around them, most too absorbed in their own affairs to pay much attention to the military personnel. Thomas felt exposed and vulnerable, caught in the open with nowhere to run. "Sir?" one of the younger soldiers asked, confusion evident in his voice. "Is everything all right?" The general didn't respond immediately. Instead, he began walking slowly toward Thomas, his eyes never leaving the homeless man's face. With each step, his expression became more certain, more resolute. Thomas wanted to look away, to blend back into the urban landscape, but something about the general's gaze held him frozen in place. When the general was perhaps 10 feet away, he stopped again. The other soldiers had followed behind him, forming a loose semicircle that effectively blocked traffic on the sidewalk. Pedestrians began to take notice, some stopping to watch while others crossed to the other side of the street. "Soldier," the general said, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command. "State your name and rank." The question hit Thomas like a physical blow. It had been years since anyone had addressed him as a soldier, years since anyone had acknowledged his service or treated him with the respect due to someone who had worn the uniform. His throat felt tight as he struggled to find his voice. "Miller, Thomas J.," he replied, the words coming automatically despite the passage of time. "Staff Sergeant, United States Army." A murmur ran through the gathered soldiers, and Thomas could see recognition dawning in some of their faces. The general stepped closer, his expression a mixture of disbelief and growing certainty. "3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment?" the general asked. Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. The Rangers were an elite unit, and their reputation was known throughout the military community. But that had been another life, another version of himself, that seemed as distant as a half-remembered dream. The general's face softened, and he reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a smartphone and quickly scrolled through several screens before stopping at what appeared to be a photograph.
He turned the phone toward Thomas, showing him an image of soldiers in combat gear standing in front of an armored vehicle.
Afghanistan, 2009, the general said quietly. Operation Mountain Fire.
Do you remember this mission, Sergeant? Thomas stared at the photograph, and suddenly he was transported back more than a decade. The image showed him and his squad after a particularly dangerous operation, their faces streaked with dust and exhaustion, but their eyes bright with the satisfaction of a mission completed successfully. He was in the center of the group, his weapon held with casual confidence, his stance reflecting the pride and professionalism that had defined his service. I remember, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. The general put away his phone and straightened to his full height. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, addressing not just his soldiers but the growing crowd of civilians who had stopped to watch. I want you to meet Staff Sergeant Thomas Miller, one of the finest soldiers I ever had the privilege to serve with. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the onlookers thought they knew about the homeless man they had been ignoring or avoiding. Thomas felt tears beginning to form in his eyes, emotions he had kept buried for years, suddenly threatening to overwhelm him. During Operation Mountain Fire, the general continued, his voice growing stronger and more formal. Staff Sergeant Miller led his squad through enemy territory to rescue 4 soldiers who had been cut off from their unit. Despite being outnumbered and under heavy fire, he managed to extract all 4 men without a single casualty. The crowd had grown larger now, with people pulling out their phones to record what was happening. But this time the cameras weren't meant to humiliate or mock. This time they were documenting something extraordinary. For his actions that day, the general said, Staff Sergeant Miller was awarded the Silver Star, the 3rd highest decoration for valor in combat that our nation can bestow. He saved 4 lives at the risk of his own, and every one of those men went home to their families because of his courage and leadership. Thomas could hardly believe what he was hearing. After years of being treated as invisible, as less than human, here was someone not just acknowledging his existence but celebrating his service in front of dozens of strangers. The cognitive dissonance was almost too much to process. The general reached out and placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder. Sergeant, he said, it is my honor to serve in the same army as you. Without warning, the general stepped back and snapped to attention. His right hand shot up in a crisp salute, held with the precision that only comes from decades of military training. For a moment, time seemed suspended as the 2 men looked at each other across the years and circumstances that had brought them to this moment. Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, as if a door that had been locked for years was suddenly opening. Muscle memory took over, and despite his ragged appearance and civilian clothes, he returned the salute with the same precision and pride that had once made him one of the Army's finest. One by one, the other soldiers in the group came to attention and rendered their own salutes. The sight of more than a dozen military personnel saluting a homeless man created a powerful visual that left the civilian onlookers stunned into silence. For 30 seconds the salutes held. Around them, the normal flow of city life had come to a complete stop. Cars had pulled over, pedestrians stood frozen on the sidewalk, and even the usual noise of downtown Chicago seemed muted in the presence of this unexpected moment of military ceremony. When the general finally dropped his hand, the spell was broken, but the impact lingered. Thomas lowered his own salute, his eyes bright with unshed tears and something that might have been hope. Sergeant Miller, the general said, his voice warm with genuine affection. Would you do me the honor of joining me for breakfast? I believe we have quite a bit to catch up on. Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As the soldiers began to disperse and the crowd slowly returned to their morning routines, he caught sight of his reflection in the coffee shop window again. The man looking back at him was still wearing torn clothes and bore the weathered appearance of life on the streets. But something fundamental had changed in his posture, in his expression, in the way he carried himself. For the first time in years, Thomas Miller remembered what it felt like to be seen as a hero rather than a problem. The recognition hadn't changed his circumstances yet, but it had changed something far more important. It had reminded him of who he really was underneath the layers of hardship and despair. As he followed the general toward the coffee shop, Thomas heard fragments of conversation from the people they passed. Some were asking questions about what they had just witnessed, others were talking about homeless veterans and how society treats its heroes. The teenager who had filmed and mocked him the day before would have been shocked to know that the pathetic excuse for a human being he had ridiculed was actually one of the bravest men his generation had produced. But perhaps more importantly, Thomas was beginning to remember it himself. The salute had been more than just a military courtesy. It had been an acknowledgement of his worth, his sacrifice, and his inherent dignity as a human being. It had been a bridge between the soldier he had been and the man he still could become. The doors of the coffee shop opened before them, and Thomas stepped inside for the first time in months. The familiar aroma of coffee and fresh pastries enveloped him, but it was the looks of respect and curiosity from the other customers that truly welcomed him home. The journey back from the invisible margins of society had begun, and it had started with a simple but powerful truth that society too often forgets. Heroes come in all forms, and sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought long after the war has ended. The coffee shop fell into an unusual quiet as Thomas followed General Morrison through the door. Conversations that had been buzzing with the typical morning energy suddenly dropped to whispers as patrons turned to stare at the unlikely pair, the distinguished military officer and the homeless man he was treating as an honored guest.
The barista who had once refused Thomas service now stood frozen behind the counter, her face a mixture of confusion and embarrassment. Her eyes darted between the general's crisp uniform with its impressive array of ribbons and Thomas's worn clothing, clearly struggling to process what she was witnessing.
"Table for two, please," General Morrison said to the hostess, his tone polite but carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being accommodated. "Somewhere we can talk privately." The hostess, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20, stammered slightly as she led them to a corner booth away from the main flow of traffic.
Thomas could feel every eye in the restaurant following their progress, and he fought the urge to shrink back into the invisibility that had protected him for so long. As they settled into the booth, General Morrison removed his cap and set it carefully on the table. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and his face bore the lines of someone who had carried heavy responsibilities for many years. When he looked at Thomas, there was no trace of the pity or disgust that had become so familiar.
Instead, his eyes held respect and genuine concern. "Coffee?" Morrison asked, signaling to their server.
"And I believe they have an excellent breakfast menu here." Thomas nodded, still struggling to believe this was really happening. The server, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, approached their table with obvious curiosity. "2 coffees, please," Morrison said, "and bring us a full breakfast, 2 of whatever your chef recommends. We have some catching up to do." As the server departed, Morrison leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table. "Tom," he said, using the familiar name that only close friends and fellow soldiers had ever used.
"I have to ask the obvious question. How did you end up here?"
The question was asked without judgment, but Thomas felt the weight of it nonetheless.
How do you explain the journey from decorated war hero to homeless veteran? How do you compress years of struggle and failure into words that make sense to someone whose life has followed a more conventional path?
"It's complicated," Thomas began, then stopped. He had used that phrase so many times over the years, usually as a way to avoid the full truth. But something about Morrison's patient expression made him want to try again. "The war didn't end when I came home," Thomas said slowly. "It just moved inside my head. Every night I'd wake up thinking I was back in Afghanistan. Every loud noise made me dive for cover. I couldn't sleep, couldn't hold a job, couldn't maintain relationships. The VA tried to help, but the waiting lists were long and the treatment didn't seem to work for me." Morrison nodded, his expression understanding rather than surprised. "How many tours did you do?" 3, Thomas replied. "The first 2 were tough but manageable. The third one was different. We lost a lot of good people, including my best friend. When I came home that final time, I wasn't the same person who had left." Their coffee arrived, and Thomas wrapped his hands around the warm mug, grateful for something to focus on besides the painful memories he was sharing. "I tried to adjust," he continued. "I really did. I went to college on the GI Bill, got married to a wonderful woman who tried to understand what I was going through. But the nightmares, the flashbacks, the anger was too much. She tried to help me for 3 years before she finally gave up. I don't blame her. Living with someone with untreated PTSD is like living with a stranger who looks like someone you used to love." Morrison's jaw tightened slightly, but he remained silent, letting Thomas tell his story at his own pace.
"I couldn't hold down steady work because of the anxiety and panic attacks. I started drinking to quiet the noise in my head, which only made everything worse. Eventually, I lost my apartment, then my car, then pretty much everything else. The streets became home because they were the only place that would have me." The breakfast plates arrived, laden with eggs, bacon, toast, and hash browns. Thomas stared at the food for a moment, unable to remember the last time he had seen such abundance.
Morrison began eating without ceremony, and after a moment's hesitation, Thomas followed suit. "How long have you been homeless?" Morrison asked between bites.
8 years, Thomas replied. Maybe 9. Time kind of blends together when you're living day to day. What happened to you? It's not uncommon. We're losing more veterans to suicide and homelessness than we lost in combat.
The system that's supposed to take care of you when you come home is broken, and too many good soldiers are falling through the cracks. I know I'm not the only one, Thomas said.
I've met dozens of other veterans on the streets. Some from Vietnam, some from Iraq, some from Afghanistan. We all have different stories, but they all end the same way. Invisible, forgotten, treated like we're the problem, instead of people who need help. Morrison nodded grimly. That's exactly why I'm here in Chicago. I'm part of a task force that's working to address veteran homelessness and PTSD treatment. We're trying to create better programs, more effective treatment options, and faster access to services. But we need stories like yours to help people understand what's really happening.
Thomas looked up from his plate, surprised. Do you want my story? I want more than that, Morrison said.
Do you remember why you joined the Army in the first place? The question caught Thomas off guard. It had been so long since anyone had asked him about his motivations rather than his failures.
I wanted to serve my country, Thomas said slowly. I wanted to make a difference, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. And did you accomplish that mission? Morrison asked. Thomas thought about the 4 soldiers he had rescued during Operation Mountain Fire, about the countless missions where his skills and leadership had brought everyone home safely. Yes, sir.
I did. Then your service isn't over, Tom.
It's just taking a different form. Morrison reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. I want you to come work with me. I need someone who understands what these veterans are going through, someone who can speak their language and help them navigate the system. I need someone who's been where they are and found a way back. Thomas stared at the card, hardly able to process what he was hearing. Sir, I don't understand.
You want to hire me? I want to offer you a position as a veteran outreach coordinator, Morrison said.
It would involve working directly with homeless veterans, helping them access services, providing peer counseling, and serving as a liaison between the veterans and the various agencies that are trying to help them. The magnitude of what Morrison was proposing began to sink in. After years of being treated as a problem to be solved or ignored, someone was asking Thomas to be part of the solution. But sir, Thomas said, his voice uncertain, I'm not exactly in a position to help anyone right now.
I don't even have a place to live. Morrison smiled, the first genuine smile Thomas had seen from him.
Tom, that's exactly why you're the right person for this job. You understand their situation in a way that no social worker or bureaucrat ever could.
You've lived their reality. He leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. This won't be easy. The pay isn't spectacular, and you'll be dealing with people who are fighting the same demons you've been fighting.
But if you're willing to do the work, I can guarantee you housing, healthcare, and the opportunity to use your experience to help other veterans who are where you've been. Thomas felt tears threatening again, but this time they weren't tears of despair. For the first time in years, someone was offering him not just charity or pity, but a chance to rebuild his life with purpose and dignity. I'll need to get cleaned up, Thomas said, suddenly self-conscious about his appearance. I'll need clothes, and I should probably see someone about my own PTSD before I try to help others. All of that is part of the package, Morrison assured him. We have temporary housing available while you get back on your feet, and comprehensive mental health services are included in your benefits. The goal isn't just to get you off the streets, Tom, it's to help you become the person you were meant to be.
As they finished their breakfast, Morrison explained more about the program and what Thomas's role would involve. He would be working with a team of social workers, psychologists, and other veterans to identify homeless veterans on the streets and connect them with services.
His experience and military background would give him credibility with people who had learned to distrust the system. There's one more thing, Morrison said as they prepared to leave. That incident yesterday with those teenagers filming and mocking you. I want you to know that several people recorded what happened this morning, and it's already starting to spread on social media. People are sharing your story, talking about how we treat our veterans, asking questions about homelessness that they never asked before. Thomas felt a mixture of anxiety and hope at the news.
The idea of being in the public eye was terrifying, but if his story could help other veterans, perhaps there was value in the exposure. As they stood to leave, the barista who had previously refused Thomas's service approached their table.
Her face was flushed with embarrassment, and her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Sir, she said to Thomas, I want to apologize for how I treated you before. I had no idea. I should have been kinder regardless, but knowing what you've done for our country.
I'm sorry. Thomas looked at the young woman, seeing in her face the same struggle that he had witnessed in so many others that morning.
They were all trying to reconcile the homeless man they had dismissed with the war hero they now knew him to be. Thank you. Thomas said simply. I appreciate that. As they walked toward the door, Thomas noticed that the atmosphere in the coffee shop had changed completely. Conversations were now focused on veterans' issues, on homelessness, on the gap between how society claims to honor its heroes and how it actually treats them. His story had become a catalyst for discussions that needed to happen.
Outside, Morrison's staff was waiting with a vehicle to take them to the Veterans Services Center where Thomas would begin the process of rebuilding his life. As they walked toward the car, Thomas caught sight of his reflection in the coffee shop window one more time. The man looking back at him was still wearing the same worn clothes, still bore the weathered appearance of years on the streets. But something fundamental had changed. The defeated posture was gone, replaced by the straight-backed bearing of a soldier who had remembered his purpose. The hollow eyes now held hope, and the invisible barrier that had surrounded him for so long had been shattered by a simple act of recognition. Thomas Miller was no longer invisible. More importantly, he was no longer lost. The journey back from the margins of society would be long and difficult, but it had begun with the most powerful force in the world, the acknowledgement of human dignity and the belief that everyone deserves a second chance. As the car pulled away from the curb, Thomas looked back at the corner where he had spent so many hopeless hours. Tomorrow, another veteran might be standing there, invisible to the world and fighting the same battles he had fought. But now, Thomas would be part of the army working to bring those soldiers home, one recognition at a time.